Smartly pressed and immaculately presented, the Nazis loved their uniforms. For the Nazi mindset, the uniform demonstrated discipline and status, and was used as part of the propaganda effort to give their dreams of a new super Germany a sense of fashion and style. Some embraced this more than others, with perhaps the most notable connoisseur of fine clothing being Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, who was known to have specially tailored flamboyant uniforms made for himself. But fashion played more of a role in Nazi culture than one might first believe. In this episode, we are going to explore the importance and some of the history behind the Nazi obsession with uniforms. Welcome to Wars of the World. Very quickly after taking up position as leader of the National Socialist German Workers, forever abbreviated thereafter by its English translation to Nazi, Adolf Hitler sought to forge an identity for its members and its various branches. He had seen how simultaneously the collapse of the militaristic ways of the times of the Kaiser had left post-war Germany clambering to learn who it was, while at the same time rivals to the Nazis, most notably the Communist Party, had clearly defined aims and a symbol with which to rally behind, namely the hammer and sickle. Hitler therefore sought a symbol with which the Nazi Party could utilize in a similar fashion that would not only identify the followers of Nazism, but also have a power of attraction to those not yet signed up. In the previous 50 years, the upper echelons of European society had developed a fascination with mysticism and the occult, and in particular became enamored with the practices of those from the East. The peoples of China and India were often seen as being closer to some as yet untapped natural power, since they had not been corrupted by the science and technology of the West that emerged in the Industrial Revolution. Thus, a number of Eastern practices and symbols were appropriated by Europeans for their use in their own pseudo-religious ceremonies, and one of these was what was known in Sanskrit as the Swastika. The swastika motif of a cross with trailing hooks at each end appears to have been in use for some 7,000 years, and was generally associated as a symbol of good fortune. To this day, it remains a sacred symbol in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Odinism, and is a common sight on temples or houses in India or Indonesia. Interest in the symbol in Germany was catapulted into the wider public consciousness as a result of the work of archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, who discovered similar symbols on very early German pottery and again on the site of the ancient city of Troy. Given how widespread its adoption appeared to be, Schliemann afforded the swastika as possessing special religious powers, if not, then certainly holding some religious significance. This history, coupled with the growing interest of eugenics and the importance of ethnicity in some European circles, afforded the symbol a relationship with the idea of genetic purity, in particular the notion of superior Aryan heredity, largely due to its adoption by those who idolized Nordic culture, this despite its adoption by non-Aryan peoples of the East. Thus, when the Nazi leaders were searching for their symbol in 1920, the swastika, as its name was Germanized into, was already in the German public zeitgeist, which would only help raise their profile. Interestingly, the swastika was also adopted by other far-right groups with similar beliefs as the Nazis, but as rivals to Hitler and his followers. Determined to fully adopt it for their cause, the Nazis had the dual intention of the symbol providing something for their followers to rally behind, while at the same time striking fear into such rivals, any rivals to their rise to power, regardless of if they had similar national or racial goals. The swastika therefore soon adorned Nazi literature, artwork, offices, and eventually onto clothing, in the forms of armbands and badges. The immediate post-war period in Germany was marred by extreme violence, as former soldiers returned home disillusioned and bitter in their defeat and apparent betrayal from their leaders in the new Weimar Republic, which replaced the Kaiser's government. With the growing influence of groups with foreign or perceived anti-German ideals, such as communists, in many instances the streets of German cities became at times war zones between ideological factions. If the Nazis were to survive, they needed a protective force, one that could guard against attacks from these other factions, and at the same time could fight back against them. Even when Hitler was speaking to small drunk crowds in beer halls, he had already begun to arrange protection for himself, in the form of ex-soldiers acting as security against dissenters. This was the genesis of the Sturmabteilung, or the SA, which translates roughly into English as stormtroopers. The SA's numbers quickly grew in the 1920s, and realizing he had an army forming, Hitler decided they needed a uniform. In this regard, Germany's circumstances actually proved fortuitous to Hitler, as Germany's markets were flooded with army surplus clothing. Gerhard Rossbach was a member of the German Freikorps, a group of paramilitaries and a devout nationalist who quickly joined Hitler's growing Nazi movement after his own efforts against the Weimar Republic were put down. In 1925, Rossbach secured a number of ex-military uniforms that originally had been intended for the army serving in Imperial Germany's African colonies. They were therefore draped in a dark brown colour, and later he would adapt these uniforms for the SA, leading to Hitler's stormtroopers forever being referred to as the Braun Hemden, the brown shirts. The brown uniformed swastika-adorned SA gave the Nazis a perception of power and discipline, even though in reality they were little better than the violent gangs used by other factions vying for power in Germany at the time. Seeing this army in combat with its rivals had the desired effects that Hitler wanted, encouraging support and striking fear. However, this was only part of the SA's modus operandi, and they were still required to act as bodyguards to Hitler, who also recognized that they needed to stand out to elevate his own public image. This led to the creation of a subordinate unit within the SA, specifically for Hitler's protection, dubbed the Schutzstaffel, or SS, meaning Protection Squad. Being subordinate to the SA, they too adopted their brown shirts, but modified them to demonstrate their special role. Among the symbols adopted by the SS was the Totenkopf, or Death's Head insignia, which already had a long and prestigious place in German military history. As the size of the party grew, its organization became more formal and included military-style ranks. They thus adopted armbands with a swastika on them, and a series of stripes determining their rank within either branch that the wearer was a member of. But these measures all served to start building a divide between the SS and the SA, the former with its extremely strict entry requirements feeling as though they were the superior branch. By the end of the 1920s, both the SA and the SS had continued to forge separate identities, demonstrated by their respective uniforms growing increasingly unique. The SS uniform was increasingly making use of the color black, and this was only exacerbated when Heinrich Himmler was appointed as the organization's leader in 1929. The growing adoption of the color black was no accident. Black had already come to denote fascism in Europe for several years by that point, most notably in Italy, where Benito Mussolini used it for his so-called voluntary militia for national security, essentially an Italian contemporary of the SA. By 1932, while on paper the SS was still a subordinate of the SA, the fact of the matter was, Himmler was now running his own ultra-fascist show, and to demonstrate this fact, the SS introduced the uniform it would become most associated with. The nearly all-black ensemble was designed by Karl Diepitsch and graphic designer Walter Heck, with the shirt remaining brown to appease the increasingly alienated SA leadership. But all else was black, from the high boots to the new military-style peaked cap, complete with the Totenkopf. The black colour of the uniform also served to make the new universal Nazi armband stand out even more with its bright red colour, upon which was a white disc and the appropriated swastika. This of course will be adopted later as the flag of Nazi Germany, and was actually conceived of by Hitler himself, the design being outlined in Mein Kampf. SS men were also issued black wool greatcoats for poor weather, which similarly carried the armband, epaulette, and collar patches of the basic uniform underneath, denoting rank, etc. Around this time, a new belt buckle upon which was engraved the motto, Meine Ehre heißt Treue, meaning my honor is loyalty, was added. But perhaps the most recognizable addition to the SS uniforms were the two S's on the collar, arranged like stylized lightning bolts. The lightning bolts are actually runes from a set of 18 Armanen runes created by Guido von List in 1906, and are similar to the ancient Sowilo rune, which symbolizes the sun, although List renamed them as Sig, meaning victory. On January 30th, 1933, German President Paul von Hindenburg named Hitler as the new German Chancellor. After more than a decade of campaigning and conspiring, Hitler and his Nazi party had finally taken power. But for Hitler, this was more than just a political appointment. The Nazis promised to fulfill the destiny of the Germanic people, and to that end, they began to interweave their twisted ideology into almost every facet of German society, like venom from a snake consuming the body of the serpent's prey. One aspect of this influence on German society that often gets overlooked is fashion. In fact, fashion served as a significant purpose to the new Germany the Nazis were building, which would pride itself on coherence, uniformity, and purpose. For Hitler, this task was especially aimed at the women of Nazi society, who he viewed as being less conformist than men, who often possessed a small collection of formal suits, work clothes, and loungewear. Women's fashion, on the other hand, was a more chaotic affair to the Nazi mind, and distasteful to Hitler, who had clear, ultra-conservative ideas of how women should dress and conduct themselves. To that end, not long after becoming Chancellor, he created the Deutsches Modeamt, or German Fashion Institute, in an effort to bring women into line with Nazi ideals. Hitler expressed disdain and even disgust at women who wore too much makeup or changed the color of their hair with dye, and he actively choked at the smell of perfume. Trousers on a woman were also seen as distinctly unfeminine, as was smoking. Therefore, this fascist fashion institute promoted more traditional styles of clothing for women, which were often looser and less flamboyant than the popular French style of clothing, which permeated German society prior to 1933. The reasoning for this was twofold, in that it was seen as promoting chastity and reflecting the Nazi idea that women's bodies should be tailored towards bearing children first and foremost, the belief being that larger women were better suited for this task than skinnier women. Patriotism and perceived Germanic purity were always at the forefront of everything the Nazis strived for, and this included clothing. With the desire for a wholly Aryan society untouched by those the Nazis saw as impure, Hitler created a twisted seal of quality for clothing in the form of special labels afforded to the clothes of manufacturers who met the stringent Nazi inspections to guarantee that no non-Aryans had been involved in the garment's manufacture. Enforcing this code of practice was the Association of Aryan Clothing Manufacturers, and it quickly became taboo, especially for the upper and middle classes, to be seen wearing clothing without this label. The hypocrisy of the Nazi regime was perhaps best displayed in this regard, for while leading female Nazis, or the wives of Hitler's upper echelons, were expected to conform to these ideals in public, in private they often embraced what Hitler was trying to stamp out. Even his consort, Eva Braun, continued her passion of wearing perfumes, while Magda Goebbels, wife of the German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, continued to wear dresses known to have been crafted by Jewish designers. Having initially been a leading member of the Fashion Institute, Mrs. Goebbels was quickly dismissed from her post when it became clear she wouldn't fully conform to Nazi ideals. As the Nazis solidified their hold on German society, an opposition was stamped out. Nazi uniforms of various types became increasingly revered, as it denoted that the wearer was involved in the creation of the Führer's dream for a new Germany. This led to a surge in contracts for uniforms denoting government positions and jobs, as well as the military, which would soon be expanding in size as Hitler did away with the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, and all now sporting swastikas. Members of the Nazi Party who owned clothing businesses naturally took a number of these lucrative contracts, and among them was Hugo Boss. Today, the name of Hugo Boss is most associated with high-end men's fashion, but its founding was a more humble affair. Boss, for whom the company takes its name, began trading in 1931 after being established in the town of Metzingen and secured a number of government contracts for police and postal uniforms before he became enamored with the Nazi ideals. Even before Hitler took power, Boss had already begun manufacturing uniforms for the SA and SS, although his influence in the design of the latter has been exaggerated in some post-war books. He did, however, work closely on things such as the types of materials chosen with leading Nazi uniform designer SS Oberfuhrer Karl Diebitsch. Boss would also be involved in the manufacturing of the uniforms for the Nazis' youth programs, namely the Hitler Youth for Boys and the League of German Girls. In young people, Hitler saw the chance to program the minds of the generation who would most likely have to fight the wars of the German destiny that lay ahead. And so creating a militaristic mindset was of paramount importance, leading to the need for uniforms. These uniforms often aped their adult army counterparts in an effort to make each boy and girl feel as though they were already participating in some grand adventure. The Nazis had started a youth program as early as 1922, and, like the SA, found its early efforts at creating a uniform largely aided by surplus army shirts. The first issue shirts were again brown army shirts left over from the war, but if these were unavailable or the boy too small to wear a small man's shirt, then white shirts were permitted. Various headwear, including berets and soft and hard peaked caps, were all adopted by various branches of the youth organizations until standardized caps were produced. Children often got to wear these uniforms in place of their school uniform, and like with adults, the wearer gained an elevated status among their peers. Interestingly, however, the uniform was also used for some small protests following a 1936 mandate which demanded that all Aryan boys join the Hitler Youth program. Parents who refused to let their children join often left their uniforms outside their front doors to be collected back up by officials, who then of course would pass on the details of the family to the local Gestapo. One of the branches of the Nazi regime which certainly didn't benefit from this new period of German history was the SA. Now firmly established in power, the brown shirts were more of a problem than an asset, since their role had been rendered somewhat superfluous, and their violent tactics, which had served Hitler so well in the 1920s, were now rather embarrassing to the Führer and his orderly society. On June 30th, 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, the SA leadership was eradicated, finally freeing the SS, which would grow to become a society of its own within Nazi Germany under Himmler, for the very elite. This also saw them finally cast off the last brown shirts of their uniform. At the same time, the SS was also building up its army branch in the form of the Waffen-SS, who adopted a variation of the German army's grey uniforms, but tailored more closely to denote their wearers' allegiance and their SS rank, which was often different to the army's. By the time of the invasion of Poland, the swastika had been carefully woven into all branches of the armed forces, and adorned somewhere on almost all uniforms. The SS's traditional black uniform soon fell out of favour as the war raged on, until in 1942 Himmler had them stripped of their markings and were repurposed for security roles, such as being issued to local collaborators in conquered lands who joined the Nazi invaders in flushing out Jews, gypsies and other undesirables. The demands of war saw the SS relax some of their recruitment policies to allow the inclusion of those from occupied lands who wished to join the Nazi cause, providing they could prove there was no one in their family tree who might have contaminated their bloodlines. As such, the uniforms of these units were often modified to include some form of symbol or emblem identifying their homelands worn on the sleeve. These often included variations on the home country's flags, such as the blue, white and red of the French 33rd Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Charlemagne. The SS were not the only ones experiencing recruitment problems during the war. Manufacturers such as Hugo Boss soon found their factories losing German men to the armed forces, and thus increasingly the company began using forced labour brought in from occupied countries. Many of these forced labourers were drafted in from concentration camps and were worked either to death or exhaustion, after which they were sent to the gas chambers, with replacements being sent back. Like all aspects of German industry involved in the war effort, the German textile industry suffered appalling devastation in the face of intense Allied bombing and the overtaking of the country by massive Allied forces, choking the Third Reich to death. In the final bloody months of Nazi Germany's existence, even uniforms were in short supply as every able-bodied man and boy were pressed into a pitiful defense of the doomed Reich. Members of the Hitler Youth as young as 14 found themselves handed ill-fitting, damaged and stained uniforms that were often strapped down to make them fit the boys' diminutive frames. The damage to the uniforms of course came from the bullets which had killed the previous owner, the stains their blood. Where once a swastika emblazoned uniform was seen as a source of pride and inspiration to German boys, by 1945, wearing it had become akin to receiving a kiss of death. Following the war, the victorious Allies set about punishing those that profited from the Nazis' brutality. Boss escaped the fates of some of the more grotesque Nazi sympathizers, but he was nonetheless fined 100,000 Reichsmarks for supporting National Socialism, and stripped of ownership of his company. Ownership instead passed to his son-in-law, Eugen Holy, who rebuilt the company, providing uniforms for the post-war Germany before eventually morphing it into the high-end brand it is today. Initially, the brand tried to distance itself from its wartime activities, until in 1999, its owners announced that it would contribute to a fund to compensate former forced labourers, before issuing a formal apology in September 2011 for its involvement in the practice. Since 1945, the images of swastikas adorning smartly pressed clothing with muted colours has come to be a symbol of fascism and government oppression. These have often been used as a basis for similar regimes presented in fiction, the most notable perhaps being the Empire from the Star Wars movies, whose entire persona is clearly inspired by the look of Hitler's Nazi Germany, even giving them the name Stormtroopers. The end of the Third Reich was of course not the end of fascism, or even of the Nazi philosophy, and in the post-war period, Nazi clothing and symbolism, especially the swastika, had been adapted by neo-Nazis and far-right groups. Initially, these groups tried to mimic the look of actual Nazi uniforms as closely as possible. However, over time, pro-Nazi fashion began to take on a style of its own, leading to the term Nazi chic being coined to identify this trend. Nazi chic grew in popularity in the 1970s, as the first generations born after the war began to reach adulthood. In many cases, it was adopted as a form of rebellion against the older generations, who would naturally be outraged at seeing youths sporting swastikas. This was particularly credited to the influence of bands such as the Sex Pistols. The authoritarian nature of Nazi uniforms has also seen them become widely adopted as part of the sexual fetish scene. Today, Nazi chic has dropped off considerably in popularity in the West, although interestingly, it has been noted as being on the rise in Far Eastern countries. In the last decade, modern Western culture has begun an active campaign to remove traces of dark history that may be revered by some. This being demonstrated by the removal of statues of US Confederate generals, for example. This move has led to problems for those who wish to reenact World War II battles as German soldiers. Increasingly, historical reenactment events have turned away groups who masquerade as German forces, for fear of causing offense to visitors. This has led to accusations of organizers trying to ignore history.